All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Bradshaw. I'm the Assistant Director of the Graduate Center, a unit of the Graduate College that focuses on professional development of all kinds for graduate students, whether it's career services, writing support, mentoring, stuff like we're talking about today, mitigating unconscious bias. You name it, we're probably involved in it or know who is. So we're a resource here for you. I'm really excited to have Earl Lee join us again as part of our broader series this semester. And today they will be talking about mitigating unconscious bias. So let me introduce Earl real quick and then we'll get started. So Earl Lee, pronouns they, them, theirs, is the Senior Director of Inclusive Learning, Engagement, and Leadership in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at the University of Arizona. So Earl works across campus to advance inclusive excellence by coordinating campus-wide workshops and learning opportunities such as this. To do this, they work with academic and administrative units to design inclusive learning plans for faculty, staff, and students to promote inclusive excellence. They have worked in higher education for over a decade, collaborating with colleagues to create transformative change and advocating for equity and justice. Earl aims to promote a climate of respect and shared responsibility that cultivates practices that empower those historically marginalized in higher education. They are a doctoral student studying justice studies, where their research interests include critical pedagogy, post-colonial theories, STEM education, Caribbean radical thought, and popular culture. Earl earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from Drake University and a master's degree in adult education and training from Regis University. And so with that, I'll turn this over to Earl. And for those of you online, please just drop your questions into the chat and we'll get those for the Q&A section at the end. So thank you so much for being here, Earl. Always appreciate collaborating with you, as well as your other members of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Always doing great stuff.
Should probably unmute myself before I start speaking. Hi, everybody. Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. So as David said, my name is Earl. We're going to talk about mitigating bias. And I focus like more on graduate student school in the title, but in reality, like this can be used in any kind of work setting that you are. It could be used in classroom settings. I know there was a couple questions about like, how do you do that in class? What does that look like? So happy to dialogue more about that further. I'm going to dive right in because as David starts to say, oh, it's like 30 minutes, like, wait a second, I forgot. This is a two-part series, particularly for this, because there's a second part in about 2 weeks, if I remember correctly, that we will go deeper into kind of looking at more case studies. So I will go through the PowerPoint as quickly as I can. With that said, I wanted to start out, I'm a big fan of quotes. And so let's start out with this quote here. To know the true reality of yourself, you must be aware not only of your conscious thoughts, but also of your unconscious prejudice, biases, and habits. And this is from an unknown person. And so this is a really good, I really just think this is a really good quote to think about how do we kind of create those conscious thoughts and aware of them and act upon them, especially when our unconscious prejudice, bias, and habits sometimes will seep in to how we navigate the world. So with that said, I will jump into a list of commitments here, and these are going to be especially fruitful for when we have our discussion, and I'll go through them relatively quickly because I do see some familiar faces from the last time I did a presentation with you all 2 weeks ago. So the community commitments, first, one of the commitment to dialogue. Honest conversation is a skill to be developed, so be open to share and be open to listening. Although this is being recorded, the first part is just great, but the second part, when we start having conversation and we start talking, remember, don't share information or experiences that are not yours, and then also what is said here stays here, but lessons that you learn should be used to enrich your life. Accountability, to take responsibility for mistakes and apologize and make amends, and let's reflect and move forward. Be courageous. I always encourage folks to choose courage over comfort, choose what's right over what's fun, fast, and easy, and respect. We are in a non-judgmental zone, but we're also here to learn, and we're here to learn with each other. And so we're mutually respecting each other as we learn. Good. Looking at the next, I want to do a quick word association with you all, right? So what I want you to do is type in the chat, and I'm going to pull my chat box up here. When you see these words pop up on the screen, what are the first thoughts that come to your head? Okay, here's the first one. Military. What is the first word that comes to you when you hear the word military? Rough, gun. Others, soldiers, camo. Anybody else? When you hear the word pilot, what comes to your head? Plane, flying, flight, adventure, fly, sky, plane. Perfect. When you hear ADHD, what comes to your head? Smart for pilot. Okay, ADHD, Amy says me. Brain, diagnoses. Anxiety, challenging. All right, when you hear the word rural South, what comes to your mind? Poor. Country, family. Farming, education or lack of. Okay, last word, when you hear Lyft driver, what comes to your mind? Students. Fun, hip, hustle. Nice car, sometimes, not all the times. So we do this word association, and I want you all to then look at this question, and please chime in, whether it's type in the chat or verbally. What informed your association? Was it real life, stories, media, guessing? What informed your assumptions earlier, your associations earlier? Mostly media, experience and references, media, past life experiences, reading. Yes. So what the thing that I want to bring about here is this conversation about biases, right? Bias is based off our own sometimes lived experiences. It's also based on experience, on media. It's based on reading, and depending on where your readings are coming from. Sometimes it's based on family and friends, and sometimes it's based on guessing and assumptions that you make. So because David politely informed us, remember, we have 30 minutes for this conversation, I won't show this quick video from the Unconscious Bias. The Royal Society did it, but I will share it later with you all, and so folks can watch it later. The interesting thing in this video that they define and they look at unconscious bias is that they talk about how this is sometimes an innate reaction It's based on assumptions. It's based on some lived experiences that people are using to associate X with Y. And there's a really great example in there. It was basically, about a cricket ball and bat cost, 10 pence. If one is cost, X amount compared to that, what it is. And people always get the answer wrong. And they say that they get the answer wrong because of the association that people are using in the word puzzle that they are given, or the word math question that they're asking. The reason is that our unconscious mind, which is a puzzle, which is malleable, which is able to evolve and change, is based on how we experience life. It's not a bad thing. It's not saying that anybody's bad for having unconscious bias or having any kind of bias. It's that is a learned behavior, but it's if we learn something, it means we can also unlearn that something. So with that said, one of the things that are so important when we think about the unconscious, when we think about bias, it's what's called the 4 I's of oppression. 4 of them: individual or internalized, interpersonal, institution, and ideological. Now, the 4 I's of oppression helps us to understand how the world is organized with terms of bias, and in terms of, the winners and the losers of the group, the oppressed, the oppressor, the exploited, the exploiter, right? At the ideological level, it says that the system is established across institutions and history as a result of the interaction and the accumulation of these effects. It means that the public policy, practice, and other norms end up creating a kind of superiority complex where one person is oppressed and the other person is the oppressor. And so what that does is that we have to think about what are ideological ways, what are structural or systemic ways that bias is within our institution, which takes us to the institutional level. At the institutional level, discriminatory treatment, prejudice, and privileges are embedded in the organizational structure, in the policies, the practice, and the programs. And so the oppression penetrates and is perpetrated at all of those levels. At the interpersonal, it talks about the interactions between individuals within and across different groups. And so there is a kind of an expression of whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether it's subtle or overt or even violent, it doesn't matter. There's an interpersonal situation that has caused oppression. Again, it doesn't matter if it is conscious or unconscious, but that is the 3rd I. And the final I is individual. So a person's belief, prejudice, ideas, experience, and actions, whether it's conscious or unconscious, internalized or externalized, that perpetuate and or are results of oppression. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about if we've got questions, but here is an example. This is the, as we use the word ideological, right? This is the ideological, this is the theoretical framing, right? But here's a nice example where we can put in practice. The ideological here is what beliefs exist about doctoral education. So the example here is that there is a question to be called into, we're called into question. Maybe, the department that you're in is saying, we want to restructure our doctoral education program. I know my PhD department, those are some ideological questions they're currently having. Like, we want to restructure. What does it look like? Where do, how do we make it work? And so at the ideological level, we start saying, what beliefs exist about the doctoral education? And in order to answer that question, you may have to look at and I go back to the other one, the systematic across institutions and history, right? Whether the public policies and practice and norms, if you go back to this diagram. So when we come and think about what exists, we're not looking at what beliefs exist here at the university. We're looking at what beliefs exist across the country. What beliefs exist in other countries. So across the entire doctoral education spectrum, what is the ideological rationale? What are people thinking about when it comes to particularly that field about the doctoral education? And then you get into the institution and you start saying to yourself, what are the rules and policies and structures that are in place to maintain those beliefs? This example could also be used to teaching, right? So for those who are grad students on the call, the question then becomes, if you would change doctoral education to say X about your teaching philosophy or the curriculum, you can also ask the same questions. What rules and policies or structures are in place at that level? Then you get to the interpersonal and you start asking the question, because of these rules that we just talked, policy and structures that we just talked about, how do people treat each other? How do they work together? How do you want to be in relationship with somebody else? And at the internalized level, you look at sense of belonging, sense of self. And then you start saying to yourself, what pressures do we put upon ourselves even without someone explicitly telling us? So for any doctoral student in the room, the internalized level, right? We, depending on where you are in the doctoral program, whether you're at the beginning, the end, the middle, there's these internalized pressures that are being imposed on you because someone may explicitly have told you that this is what the doctoral education experience is supposed to be from an ideological level. So now we're seeing where all of the eyes are kind of trickling down into each other. Any comments or questions on that? Okay. We're going to skip the small group activities for the sake of time, because again, as I said, we are going to be doing this later. But here's where I think it's important. I pulled this image from a LinkedIn post that I saw. And I thought this was interesting because, here we can see the 4 I's. The ideological says that cultural beliefs, values, norms, ideas, and assumptions often unexamined. At the institutional level, we're looking at policies, procedures, structural and systematic laws and healthcare, education, etc. Interpersonal level actions, language, and behaviors that show up in relationship with other people. And then that they internalize the beliefs, thoughts, and feelings about ourselves that can have a positive, negative, or neutral tint. At the end of that, I think the bottom line here, which is literally on the bottom line of this diagram, says working towards racial equity or any kind of equity, gender equity, working towards disability justice, working towards any kind of sense of belonging and inclusion and equity, and or collective liberation from all forms of oppressive and oppression involves examining and creating change in all of these spaces, and at the ideological, the interpersonal, institutional, and the internalized levels. With that said, I wanted to come to Lily Zen. Lily is a researcher particularly on microaggression as well. And one of the things, and so topics around bias and oppression. One of the quotes I really like from Lily says, "The stewards of a space are those who set the norms and lead by example in a place or organization have the biggest influence over whether a space is psychologically safe. Organizations have many spaces, work teams, department units, cross-functional teams, town halls, etc., and thus many stewards." So I urge each of you to think about Lily's quote here and think about how you are a steward, how you are a steward of the spaces that you occupy, because you can make the biggest influence. And I say that because, and I'm going to go back to this diagram here. When we think about all of these levels and the four eyes of oppression, one of the things I look at is, in order for us to really get to impacting the ideological or the institutional level of oppression, we should start with the internalized. We should start with the thoughts and beliefs and feelings and examining who we are and how bias, prejudice, or any of those privileges may show up in our daily life, and also how we interact with others when they do, so at the interpersonal level. But Earl, how do you do this, right? So here are some strategies for confronting bias. And I urge you all to continue your own research in doing this and learning. But one of the things that are important is, let's start with noticing bias in ourselves. And when we notice it in ourselves, we may start noticing it in other people. And don't restrict yourself to biases about groups with which you don't have anything in common. In reality, for example, women can be biased against women, and etc. LGBTQ people can be unconsciously perpetrating cisgender and heteronormative bias. Noticing bias is the first step in this process. And then don't stop at noticing it. Practice ways to address it and challenge it in yourselves and in your peers, especially, sometimes when people always, one of the questions I get usually, it's October now, so about in a month, if I go to a classroom, one of the things I often hear from students is like, I'm going home for Thanksgiving or Christmas or winter holidays, and how do I deal with that uncle who's annoying and who said, the most outrageous things and I don't agree with them, right? And I think that's when you start to also think about it, is how do you notice bias in yourself? And then how do you then have those conversations with others, especially if you're around a dinner table and, people you need to address those biases. One of the things you can do is what we call a micro-intervention. So micro-intervention are everyday words or deeds, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicates to targets of microaggression several things: that they're valid, their experiences are valid, that they're valued as a person. It affirms that their racial or group identity is appreciated. It shows support and encouragement, and you reassure that person that they're not alone. So those are important things to do with micro-interventions. And what does that look like, right? There's three different types. The first one is micro-affirmation. One of the interesting things that this was actually the first one that came around was micro-affirmation. A lot of people are very familiar with micro-affirmation. It's you verbalizing to the person that you see them as human, you see their racial and cultural identity, you send a message that there is a strong sense of belonging and a strong purpose. The other one is called micro-protections. Micro-protections are often an opportunity for you, as somebody who may or may not share this person's marginalized identity, to kind of help understand, especially the young folks, understand how bias and discrimination may show up. So if you have a child, for example, or you have a niece and nephew, a close friend's child that calls you aunt or uncle, or any other, or just calls you a family member, you have somebody that you want to say to them, this is what bias is, this is what discrimination looks like. But we still can be proud of all our identities. This is what micro-protection is. So it's helping by teaching. So when you go home for the holidays, this is a great way to teach young ones what bias and discrimination is and how that may be a learned behavior, but they can start unlearning it much earlier than other people have. And the last one is called micro challenge. And this is a direct challenge that aims to disarm, disrupt, and deflect biased behaviors and policy. It's not subtle, and it's kind of a show of confrontational force when something discrimination or bias occurs. So those are ways to for internalized and interpersonal strategies. Here are a few strategies for confronting bias at the institution or ideological or systematic level. It's important to think about how do we reframe conversations to focus on fair treatment and respect and away from discrimination and protected class. So if you look at, for example, if you are in an academic department and you're, because I know we have faculty and staff on the call as well, think about the application cycle. Think about the cycle for a grad student. What does it look like? And there's employment here, but think about it for a grad student. So you're a grad student and you are, you submit your cover letter, your CV, your essay, all that stuff. I think it's an opportunity for that entire process to be reviewed. If you work in a lab as a graduate student, how are you all thinking about the screening process for new students that you're going to hire? What are their onboarding like? How do you assign them work? Do you provide mentorship to those students? How do you evaluate their performance? These are things that you can think about. If you're teaching a class, thinking about the life cycle of that class from beginning to end. When I designed my first class, someone said to me, think about what you want the students to do at the end. How are you going to evaluate their performance? And how are you going to know that they learned what you wanted them to learn? And I worked my way backwards in designing my class. The other thing is that you can identify, support, and collaborate with effective programs that increase diversity in the pipeline. And as graduate students, as you are continuing to find ways around the universe and around this big bad wolf called academia, what are ways that you are engaging and volunteering your time? And how is that being compensated, or how is that being supported by your department? If you're being asked to sit on that diversity committee, what are the ways that you're negotiating, whether it's time away from somewhere else, in order for that labor to occur? Other strategies include supporting projects that encourage positive images of people of color, LGBTQ folks and women. How are you distributing their stories? How are you stereotype busting? The research shows that the mere positive image of a specific group of people can combat any kind of hidden bias. Pay attention to gap closing practices. So for grad students, I encourage you to think about those faculty and staff who are really good at connecting with you as a student, or you have done a really good job connecting with other students. What are they doing to manage their bias? Have you asked them? What practices are they engaging in? And how can you apply those practices to your work? And then stop tone policing. One of the authors I was reading in her blog defines tone policing as when marginalized people speak up about our strategies and people from more dominant groups focus on what we said and not how we said it. Sorry, not what was said, but how we said it. So tone policing looks something like this. Someone said something, and you're like, "Ooh, that sounds aggressive. That was sassy. That was, any kind of word that doesn't focus on the actual message itself, but focus on how the person said what was said." So think about how are you hearing tone policing activities in your department, and how can you stop it? So we are coming to a close in the last, getting ready to close over. But before I do this, I do want to go back to this slide about supportive environment. And I highly encourage folks to check out Verna Meyer's video. She defines bias as the stories we make up about people before we know who they actually are. And one of the things that she says that we should start looking at, who do we trust? Who are we afraid of? How are we creating authentic relationship with people, whether it be Black people, young Black folks, whether it be other folks who are different than we are? How are you creating authentic relationships with folks like that? And that is also important for you to consider as you continue to create a more supportive environment. I want to close out with this quote because I do enjoy a good quote. This quote was taken from this bridge called My Back, which is a compilation of writings from radical women of color. It is an edited volume, and it says, to assess the damage is a dangerous act. To stop, there's even more dangerous. What we say and what we do ultimately comes back to us. So let us consider our responsibility, place in it our hands, and carry it with dignity and strength. You, as a steward of the spaces that you're in, have a responsibility to carry, a sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging with dignity and strength. And so I urge each of you, as you think about ways you can mitigate bias, that you think about ways that you can do it at all 4 levels that we talked about in the 4 I's of oppression. At the individual or internalized level, at the institutional, at the interpersonal, and also at the ideological. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I know we're going to turn over here for a quick chat. And so I'll let David take it over. I know he'll stop the recording as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Earl. Really appreciate you introducing us to ways to overcome bias, both unconscious and more overt. And really look forward to opening the discussion up. So this concludes the recorded portion. For those of you that need to head out, I will be dropping a survey link in the chat, so I highly encourage you to take that. But with that, thank you again so much for going over this important topic, Earl. So thanks so much.